He was the most powerful man on Earth, commander-in-chief during the worst war in human history. And then, on an otherwise quiet Thursday afternoon in rural Georgia, it was over in less than 15 minutes. No one in the room fully understood what had just happened. No one outside would know for hours. And when the truth finally reached the rest of the world, it stopped everything. This is the story of the final hours of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the hidden physical collapse, the people who were with him, the decisions left unfinished, and the secrets that died alongside him. By early April of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt had been president for 12 years. He had guided the United States through the Great Depression, through the darkest days following Pearl Harbor, and through the sweeping campaigns of the Second World War across 2 oceans. He was 63 years old. To most Americans listening to his voice on the radio, he sounded the same as ever, measured, confident, commanding. But the people who saw him in person told a very different story. Since at least 1944, the men and women closest to Roosevelt had watched him deteriorate in ways that alarmed them. His face had grown gaunt. His collar, once snug around a thick neck, now hung loose. His hands trembled when he held papers. He lost track of conversations mid-sentence. He fell asleep at his desk during meetings. Aides learned to leave briefing documents short because he simply could not sustain attention the way he once had. Dr. Howard Bruen, a cardiologist attached to the White House, had examined Roosevelt in March of 1944 and was immediately alarmed. Roosevelt's blood pressure had climbed to levels that, in Bruen's professional judgment, made a catastrophic event not merely possible, but increasingly likely. Bruen noted enlarged heart, hypertensive retinopathy, changes in the blood vessels at the back of the eye consistent with dangerously high and sustained blood pressure, and a cardiovascular system under severe strain. Bruen's findings were shared with Dr. Ross McIntyre, Roosevelt's personal physician and the Surgeon General of the Navy, but McIntyre downplayed the severity of the situation, at least publicly. Officially, Roosevelt was described as suffering from mild fatigue. Nothing more. What the American public did not know, what even many senior officials did not know, was that their president had been managing a cascade of serious medical conditions for years. Polio had taken the use of his legs in 1921, a fact that was managed with extraordinary care by the press corps, who by unspoken agreement rarely photographed him in his wheelchair. But beyond the polio, Roosevelt was dealing with severe hypertension, arteriosclerosis, heart disease, and what Bruen privately believed to be progressive heart failure. The man who appeared so powerful, so in command, was in physical terms extraordinarily fragile. Bruen had placed Roosevelt on a strict regimen, limited working hours, mandatory afternoon rest, reduced salt intake, and a series of medications including digitalis to support his failing heart function. Roosevelt complied to a point. But the presidency does not pause for a patient's recovery schedule, and the demands of a world war made genuine rest almost impossible to sustain. Even in his weakened state, Roosevelt was receiving ambassadors, signing orders, and exchanging cables with Churchill and Stalin on a near-daily basis. The press knew far more than they printed. Reporters who traveled with the president had seen the deterioration with their own eyes. The understanding, unspoken but firm, was that such observations stayed off the record. This was not unique to Roosevelt. The conventions of the era placed a heavy premium on the privacy of public figures, and the wartime atmosphere added another layer of restraint. Publishing a detailed account of the president's physical decline while American troops were fighting and dying overseas was seen by most journalists of the period as something close to an act of sabotage, so they said nothing. And the American public continued to elect and trust a man whose body was, by any clinical measure, failing. By early 1945, those closest to him were watching him closely, not because they expected him to recover, but because they feared how little time remained. His deterioration had been visible to anyone paying attention during the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill met to negotiate the post-war shape of Europe. Photographs taken at Yalta circulated widely afterward, and the reaction was consistent. Roosevelt looked like a man who had aged 10 years and 12 months. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes appeared distant. Churchill, for his part, was reportedly shaken by what he saw, privately expressing to aides his concern about Roosevelt's capacity to carry the weight of the decisions being made. Despite all of this, Roosevelt pressed forward. He had always pressed forward. He returned from Yalta and addressed a joint session of Congress in March of 1945, notably delivering the speech while seated rather than standing at the podium, citing the weight of his leg braces. It was one of the very few times he had publicly acknowledged any physical limitation. For those who understood what it meant, it was a significant moment. He needed rest. His doctors told him so. And so, in late March of 1945, Roosevelt made arrangements to travel to Warm Springs, Georgia, a place he had been going since 1924, drawn by the warm mineral pools that seemed to ease the pain and stiffness that followed his polio. He called it the Little White House. It was modest, comfortable, and removed from Washington's relentless pressure. He had recovered there before. Those around him hoped he would again. He arrived in Warm Springs on March 30th, 1945. Within days, observers noted that he did seem to be improving, eating slightly better, sleeping more, appearing a little more alert. There was reason, however cautious, for optimism. But the numbers told a different story. Dr. Bruin was monitoring his blood pressure daily, and the readings remained alarming. On the morning of April 12th, Bruin recorded a blood pressure of 180 over 110, dangerously elevated. He administered medication and noted the reading carefully. There was nothing else to do but watch. What no one in Warm Springs that morning could have known was that they had fewer than 8 hours left with Franklin Roosevelt. The morning of April 12, 1945, began without any particular sense of foreboding at the Little White House in Warm Springs. Roosevelt woke and went through his usual routine. He ate breakfast. His appetite had been somewhat better in recent days, which the staff took as an encouraging sign. He reviewed some correspondence. He was, by all accounts, in reasonable spirits. The sun was out. The Georgia spring was warm. There were plans for a barbecue that afternoon, organized by friends and neighbors who had come to welcome the president. Roosevelt had also agreed to sit for a portrait that morning. The artist was Elizabeth Shumatov, a Russian-born painter who had painted Roosevelt before. She had been invited by Lucy Mercer Rutherford, a woman whose presence at Warm Springs that day would later become one of the more quietly significant details of the entire story. Lucy Mercer had first entered Roosevelt's life decades earlier when she worked as a social secretary for Eleanor Roosevelt. The two had become close. Closer, it emerged in 1918 than Eleanor had known. When Eleanor discovered correspondence between Franklin and Lucy, it nearly ended the marriage. The two remained apart for years, though their connection was never fully severed. By the time of Roosevelt's presidency, Lucy had married a wealthy widower named Winthrop Rutherford and moved largely out of Roosevelt's daily life, officially. Unofficially, she had continued to see Roosevelt, with visits arranged quietly, with the assistance of Roosevelt's daughter, Anna. Eleanor, living her own increasingly separate life from her husband, was largely unaware of these ongoing meetings. On April 12, 1945, Lucy was at Warm Springs. So was Shumatov. So were several of Roosevelt's closest aides and staff. It was, by the standards of wartime Washington, a relaxed and almost domestic morning. Roosevelt sat in his leather chair in the living room, dressed in a dark red tie and gray suit, while Shumatov worked. He was reviewing papers, signing documents, glancing at reports. He appeared attentive. He made small talk. The atmosphere in the room was easy, unhurried. Daisy Suckley, a close friend and distant cousin, who had given Roosevelt his beloved Scottish terrier, Fala, was also present, knitting quietly nearby. Laura Delano, another cousin, sat across the room. The fire crackled. Outside, the Georgia pines were still in the warm midday air. Shumatov later noted that Roosevelt had seemed engaged that morning, more present than she had seen him in some time. He had commented on the painting's progress, made a small joke, and appeared to be genuinely at ease. She was perhaps 45 minutes into the sitting when everything changed. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, the president raised his hand slowly to his temple. His head then dropped forward, his chin settling toward his chest. Those in the room initially assumed he had simply dozed off. It was not unusual, but within moments, something about the stillness was wrong. His body slumped. He did not stir. Shumatov later described the room going from quiet to alarmed in a matter of seconds. A Filipino servant, Joe Esperancilla, and a Secret Service agent moved quickly. Dr. Bruen was summoned immediately. Lucy Rutherford, understanding the gravity of what was unfolding, slipped from the room and left the property before any further chaos could develop. When Bruen arrived and examined Roosevelt, he found what he had feared for more than a year. The president had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a rupture of a blood vessel in the brain, catastrophic in its severity. His blood pressure, when Bruen measured it, had reached 300/190. The human body simply cannot sustain numbers like those. Bruen and the local physician who was also summoned, Dr. James Paulin, worked to stabilize Roosevelt. Paulin arrived to find the president in deep unconsciousness, with irregular breathing and no response to stimulation. There was nothing that could be done, not in 1945, in a small house in rural Georgia, and very likely not anywhere at all given the scale of what had occurred. At 3:35 in the afternoon on April 12, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was pronounced dead. He never regained consciousness. He never spoke another word. He did not know, in those final minutes, that the man sitting for a portrait had become a man leaving the world. The immediate hours after Roosevelt's death were a tangle of practicalities, grief, and the quiet management of things that could not be allowed to become public. The first order of business, and the most delicate, was Lucy Rutherford. She had already left the premises, but her presence at Warm Springs on the day Roosevelt died was a fact known to several people in the room. For the time being, no one spoke of it. The official account of who was present when Roosevelt collapsed was carefully constructed to omit her name entirely. It would be months before Eleanor Roosevelt learned that Lucy had been there, and when she did learn, through a source outside the immediate circle, it was a wound that cut deeply. Eleanor had, by most accounts, made a kind of peace with the emotional distance of her marriage, but the knowledge that her daughter Anna had helped facilitate these meetings without telling her was a different matter. The relationship between Eleanor and Anna, already complicated, grew more strained in the aftermath. For now, though, the immediate crisis was informational and constitutional. Vice President Harry S. Truman was in Washington when the news reached him. He had been spending the late afternoon with Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn when a call came from the White House asking him to come immediately. He arrived at the White House at 5:25 p.m. and was met by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was composed in a way that those present described as remarkable given the circumstances. She placed her hand on his arm and told him, simply and directly, that the president had died. Truman's response, asking what he could do for her, prompted a quiet reply from the former First Lady. She told him that the question was what could be done for him because he was the one now facing the world's burdens. Truman was sworn in as the 33rd President of the United States at 7:09 p.m. That same evening, in the cabinet room of the White House, surrounded by a small gathering of officials and family, he later told reporters that the feeling of that moment was like the moon, the stars, and all the planets falling on him at once. What made the transition so jarring, beyond the obvious shock of the death itself, was how little Roosevelt had shared with Truman about the most critical matters facing the country. Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. He had met privately with Roosevelt only twice during that period. He had not been briefed on the full details of the Manhattan Project, the secret program developing the atomic bomb. He had not been included in the inner circle of military planning for the final stages of the war against Japan. He had not been given the complete picture of what Roosevelt had agreed to at Yalta, or the private concerns some advisors had about Soviet intentions. He was, in practical terms, walking into the most consequential job on Earth, knowing only a fraction of what he needed to know. The next morning, April 13th, Secretary of War Henry Stimson asked to speak with Truman privately and informed him in full about the existence of the Manhattan Project. Truman listened. He absorbed it. He had a war to finish, a world to manage, and a country that was still in mourning. Back in Warm Springs, Roosevelt's body had been prepared for transport. Dr. Bruen wrote up his notes carefully. The cause of death was listed as a cerebral hemorrhage. That much was straightforward. What was less straightforward, and what would generate discussion among medical historians for decades, was the question of how much those around Roosevelt had known about the true state of his health, and whether the American public had been adequately informed. In a democracy, the question of presidential fitness is not a trivial one. The argument that Roosevelt's privacy deserved protection was real. The argument that voters in the 1944 election, which Roosevelt won in a landslide, might have made a different decision had they known the extent of his physical decline, was equally real. Dr. McIntyre, who had publicly reassured the press and the public about Roosevelt's health on multiple occasions, would face those questions for the rest of his life. He maintained that Roosevelt had been fit to serve. Bruin, who outlived McIntyre and spoke more candidly in later interviews, painted a picture of a man whose body had been deteriorating steadily and significantly for well over a year before his death. The full details of Roosevelt's medical records remained restricted for decades. On the morning of April 13th, Roosevelt's body was placed aboard a presidential train, a specially equipped railway car called the Ferdinand Magellan, for the long journey back to Washington. The train moved slowly through the American South and up through the eastern seaboard overnight. It was dark, and along the route, in towns and at crossings, people gathered. Word had spread quickly. There was no internet, no television. The news traveled over radio and telephone, and then by word of mouth. And yet, within hours of the announcement, Americans across the country knew. They gathered at train stations and at crossings to stand in silence as the train passed. Some held lanterns or candles. Some simply stood in the dark and watched the train go by. It was one of the more quietly extraordinary public moments of the 20th century. A country at war, exhausted and yet undefeated, pausing in the middle of the night to mark the passage of a leader who had carried them through nearly everything. The scenes were repeated over and over along the route. A photograph taken at one station in the early morning hours captures a small group of men standing at the edge of the tracks, hats removed, heads bowed. Behind them, the train disappears into darkness. There were no signs, no speeches, no officials, just people standing in the dark. Eleanor Roosevelt traveled with the body. She sat quietly for much of the journey, reading, and reportedly told those with her that she was not ready for the grief yet, that there was too much still to be done. She had, in many ways, spent years preparing for this possibility. That did not make it easier. The train arrived in Washington, D.C. on the morning of April 13th. A procession carried Roosevelt's flag-draped coffin through the Capitol. The streets were lined with people. Soldiers lined the route. A band played Chopin's funeral march. The weight of the moment was visible on the faces of everyone present. Grown men wept openly on Pennsylvania Avenue. Military officers stood at attention with tears running down their faces. Some in the crowd had been children during Roosevelt's first inauguration in 1933 and had never known an America governed by anyone else. For that generation, his death did not feel like the loss of a politician. It felt like the loss of something structural, the removal of a fixed point around which the country had oriented itself through its two worst crises in living memory. From Washington, the body was taken by train to Hyde Park, New York, the Roosevelt family estate along the Hudson River, for burial. Roosevelt had expressed clear wishes about this. He wanted to be buried at Springwood, the Hyde Park property where he had grown up, in the rose garden he loved. He had even left written instructions specifying exactly where in the garden the grave should be placed and how the ceremony should be conducted. He was buried at Hyde Park on April 15, 1945, in a simple white coffin in the rose garden of Springwood, just as he had directed. Eleanor survived him by 17 years. She became, in many ways, a more public and influential figure after his death than she had been even as First Lady, serving as a delegate to the United Nations, chairing the commission that drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and continuing to speak and write with a force that surprised many who had underestimated her. She never spoke extensively in public about the personal details of their marriage, but those who knew her understood that the final chapter of it, the secrets revealed after his death, had left marks that did not fully heal. Roosevelt died 25 days before Germany surrendered. He did not live to see VE Day. He did not live to see the end of the war in the Pacific. He did not see the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. He did not witness the formal Japanese surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, the moment that officially ended the Second World War. He had spent 12 years working toward the victory that came 3 months after his death. Truman, thrown into the presidency without preparation, faced an immediate cascade of decisions that would define the second half of the 20th century. Within months, he would be asked to authorize the use of the atomic bomb, a weapon whose full destructive capacity he had only learned about the day after Roosevelt died. He would oversee the occupation of Germany and Japan. He would navigate the first serious confrontations of what would become the Cold War. As it became clear that the Soviet Union had no intention of honoring the agreements made at Yalta, he would lay the groundwork for the Marshall Plan and the formation of NATO. None of these challenges had been handed to him with a set of instructions. Roosevelt had made his decisions in his own mind, shared them selectively, and carried the strategic thread of American policy largely within himself. When he died, that thread was cut. The most consequential of those inherited burdens included the shape of the United Nations, the terms of the occupation of Germany and Japan, the management of the Soviet relationship, and the beginning of what would become the Cold War. All of it fell to a man who had been kept almost entirely outside Roosevelt's inner circle, and who was now expected to navigate crises of extraordinary complexity with minimal preparation. Roosevelt's approach to the Soviets had been, to put it carefully, optimistic. He believed, or at least he had proceeded as though he believed, that Stalin could be managed, that cooperation was achievable, that the alliance that had defeated Hitler could be sustained into the post-war period. Churchill was considerably more skeptical. The debates between them about how hard to push back on Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe in early 1945 were real and consequential. Whether Roosevelt, had he lived, would have eventually adopted a harder posture toward the Soviet Union, as Truman did, is a question historians have debated for 80 years. There is no clean answer. What can be said is that the man who had crafted American foreign policy through the war was gone before the war was finished, and that the world that emerged from those final months was shaped in significant part by the decisions of men who were working without the leader who had set the course. At Yalta, Roosevelt had obtained promises from Stalin regarding free elections in Poland and the other Eastern European countries liberated from German occupation. Those promises were, within months, revealed to be meaningless. Whether Roosevelt understood at the time that they were likely to be hollow, whether his physical deterioration had affected his judgment at Yalta, as some historians have argued, remains contested. What is not contested is that, by the time the post-war world took shape, the man who had shaped the strategy was gone. The era he had defined was over in a matter of hours on a warm April afternoon in Georgia, while a painter worked at her easel and the birds were calling outside. April 12, 1945, did not mark just the end of a presidency. It marked the end of a political era that had begun in 1933, when a paralyzed man with extraordinary will had taken the oath of office in the depths of the worst economic disaster in American history and told a nation gripped by fear that the only thing it had to fear was fear itself. 12 years, 4 terms, 1 Great Depression, 1 World War, and a physical decline so carefully hidden that the full scale of it only became widely known years after his death, when medical records were reviewed and the accounts of those who had been in the room were finally published. The manner of his death, sudden, almost instantaneous at the level of consciousness, meant that there were no final words, no deathbed conversations, no last instructions passed along. Whatever Roosevelt may have planned to say or do in the weeks and months ahead died with him in that chair. What survived was a record of action. The New Deal programs that had kept millions of Americans employed and solvent during the Depression. The Lend-Lease program that had sustained Britain before the United States formally entered the war. The alliances and military strategies that had brought the country from the shock of Pearl Harbor to the edge of final victory. The blueprint, however imperfect and incomplete, of an international order built on cooperation rather than pure national rivalry. These were not small things, nor was the question of what might have been done differently. The decisions left unmade, the secrets kept too long, the physical reality hidden from the people who had trusted him with the highest office in the land. Roosevelt was a man of enormous capacity and enormous contradictions, and the final chapter of his life contained both in full measure. He died in the middle of a war. He died with a portrait half finished. He died surrounded by people who cared about him, and at least one person whose presence there was itself a kind of secret. And he died, according to every account, without any awareness that the end was arriving. One moment he was there, present, alive, raising a hand to his temple. And then, within seconds, he was gone. The world he left behind took decades to process what it had lost and what it had inherited. In some respects, it is still working that out. Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945, was not the end of the war. It was not the end of the struggles and tensions that would define the decades that followed, but it was, without question, the end of something. A chapter in American life that stretched back through the Depression and the war, and the long, slow accumulation of decisions made by a man who understood power and held onto it in every sense until the very last moment. The people who stood at those train crossings in the dark on the night of April 12th, hats in hand, were mourning something specific. Not just a president, not just a commander-in-chief, something harder to name, the particular feeling of having been led through something almost unsurvivable and coming out the other side, only to find that the man who led you there was gone before the journey was finished. History rarely waits for the right moment. It does not pause for a clean ending. Roosevelt's story ended in a chair in Georgia on a spring afternoon, with a portrait unfinished on an easel nearby. What came next was, in every sense, a different world. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.